All right, so we are in Chavdal, the modal of 24a. We're in the middle of our analysis of the verses, specifically in relation to who qualifies to be a Sotah, depending on the relationship between the husband and wife. So there are two relationships that might be excluded from the Torah's description. Clearly, Torah states that he warns or he takes his wife to the temple to go through the proceeding. So obviously it's not a random woman. It's got to be his wife. But then we identify two relationships in which the man and woman are connected to each other, but not exactly wife yet, not exactly husband and wife yet. And the two we said, one is an engaged woman, halachically engaged, not engaged as we know it today, but rather betrothed, arusa, in which the first half of the marriage ceremony was complete. He gave her the ring, but the second half of the marriage ceremony, the actual completion of the marriage, the nisuin, was not done yet. So they are connected, but it's not exactly his wife yet. And the other is the shemeres yavam, the one who is waiting on her deceased husband's brother. Right? This is the law we repeated a number of times. The Torah states that if a man dies without children, then his brother shall marry his deceased brother's wife, his sister-in-law, and that way the two of them can establish the lineage of their brother/husband. And this marriage rolls over from the first marriage. The second brother doesn't have to take any ritual action to make this marriage valid. By biblical law, all he has to do is consummate the marriage with her. So again, they're not exactly husband and wife yet because the marriage hasn't been consummated, but they're certainly connected to each other in that the marriage of the deceased husband rolls over to the second brother and is pending, waiting for the brother to take it on by consummating the marriage. And we discussed yesterday the virtue of each one in terms of which one of these two relationships linked them more to each other. On the one hand, the engaged woman is more linked to her husband or her intended because the husband took an action. He himself took an action. He gave her a ring. And with that action, she now, if she were to be unfaithful, would be liable for capital punishment as a result of his action. Whereas the brother-in-law, whose brother died childless, he did nothing to be connected to this woman. He just happens to exist. He happens to be alive at the time of his brother's death, and that's why he's connected to this woman, but he took no action. On the other hand, the brother of the deceased man, the deceased husband, that brother doesn't need to take any ritualistic action to be connected to her. The marriage is complete already. He just has to take it by consummating the marriage. So in that sense, he's more linked than the engaged woman who still has more ritual to go through. They still have chuppah to go through. So there's the up and the down of each one. Specifically, how this played out in halacha, this distinction, is Rabbi Yonasson's of the view, like our Mishnah, that both of these women are excluded from the Sotah law because they aren't considered married. Whereas in Rabbi Yoshia's view, the engaged woman is not included in the law of the Sotah, whereas the one waiting for her brother-in-law to consummate the marriage is included in the Sotah law. Yeah, we're clear on this. Now, specifically for our discussion today, what are the verses that they each cited to support their views? Rabbi Yoshia said, well, let's start with the premise. We both agree, the Torah says, which you mentioned earlier, that he takes his wife to the temple, so they have to be married. However, the Torah, says Rabbi Yoshia, expands the definition of who's considered married. How so? Because when the Torah introduces the law, it says, ish, each and every man. Literally translated, man. But that's the Hebrew way, that's the biblical way of saying each and every. So instead of just saying a man who warns his wife and so on and so forth, it says each and every man, to expand the definition of who this man is. And thus Rabbi says, even someone who's not exactly all husband, but almost husband, all he's missing is just the consummation. But really the whole marriage is there already, as in the case of the brother of the deceased husband. That too is included in the one who's in the Sotah law.
But
not the engaged one. That's excluded by the fact that the Torah says it has to be her husband. So on the one hand, Torah says her husband, so we have to exclude something. So we exclude the engaged woman. But on the other hand, the Torah says each and every man, to expand the definition of marriage, of the marriage. And therefore we include the Shemeres Yavam, the one waiting for the deceased brother. Right? Which is why do we include the deceased brother? Why do we include the Shemeres Yavam rather than include the engaged one? That was the logic we introduced yesterday. Because in Rabbi Yeshia's view, the woman waiting for a deceased husband's brother is more linked to him than the engaged woman is linked to her intended husband. Right? And therefore, when the Torah expands the definition of who's considered a married person, we include the one most closely attached to marriage, namely the one waiting for the deceased husband's brother. Following? In other words, sorry?
I'm just trying to understand how the verse each and every man is a support for only.
Because when you because we have two conflicting things. Torah is exclusive by saying he takes his wife, that's exclusive, and it's not his wife, doesn't count, right? But then the Torah is inclusive by saying each and every man.
Right.
So now, whenever you have an exclusion and an inclusion, then the inclusion must be limited to that which is most closely related to the principle. So between these two relationships, engaged woman versus the Shemeres Yavam, which one is most closely linked to the marriage?
You have to limit something, right?
You have to limit something. That's correct. So you have to limit something, but you have to include something else. So we limited the one farther away, which is the engaged woman. But including, we're going to include that which is most closely linked to the principle, which in Rabbi Yeshia's view is the one waiting for a deceased husband. Why is it most closely linked? Because there's no action required other than consummation. No ritual action required other than consummation. So this is Rabbi Yeshia's view. Whereas Rabbi Yonasan said, we have two verses which exclude non-wife. Twice the Torah says his wife or her husband, actually. In one case it says his wife, he takes his wife. In the other case it says she, when the Kohen warns her, the Torah describes the Kohen's speech, and the Kohen warns her and says, you should know that if you drink this water, it's going to be and you're guilty, there's going to be terrible curses, right? The Kohen warns her. So the Torah describes it. So Torah says, if you were unfaithful instead of your husband, meaning you slept with a man other than your husband, then such and such is going to happen to you. So because it says other than your husband, that's the second time where the Torah excludes, and it's not husband. So because the Torah has double exclusion in Rabbi Yonasan's view, therefore we have to exclude both cases. We exclude both the engaged woman plus the Shemeres Yavam, the one who's waiting for the deceased husband's brother. So now the question becomes, what do each of these two opinions do with the other verses? Rabbi Yonasan, who came to exclude both cases, what does he do with the expansive verse that says each and every man? Right? And Rabbi Yeshua, which says that the one waiting for the deceased husband's brother is still included in the Sotah law, what does he do with the exclusive description of the verse which says you misbehaved instead of your husband? Right? You follow me? They each have to substantiate the other one's verses.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so that's what the Gemara is about to, that's the exercise we're about to go through now. Each opinion is substantiating the verses that the other one used as a support for their own view. Because if it's a support for the other view, it's a contradiction to your view, right? So you have to substantiate those verses.
Right. So each has to substantiate the other's
support. That's right. Each has to substantiate the verses that support the opposing view.
Supports their view.
That supports the opposing view.
That's
right. That's correct. So that's where we are. We're on the third to last line on Chodal Amud Aleph 24a, second to last word. Rabbi Yonasan, who is like our Mishnah, which is of the view that the Sotah proceeding is exclusively a complete marriage between husband and wife, to the exclusion of both the engaged woman, the Arusa, the betrothed woman, and to the exclusion of the Shemeres Yavam, the one waiting. for a deceased husband's brother, excludes them both. So this verse, which Rabbi Yoshia quoted, which reads, ish, each and every man, and this verse, ish, each and every man, is an inclusive verse. So we have to include some sort of relationship that's not explicitly stated. My Ovidle, what does he do with that verse? Considering that he excludes both of these relationships. So what does he do? What relationship would he include in the law of the Sotah, considering the verse which says, each and every man? So says the Gemara, Rabbi Yonasan would need that verse to include other relationships that we might have excluded. Namely, 3 cases. The Rabbi comes to include Eishes Cheresh, a woman married to a deaf mute. The Eishes Shaita, a person married to a Shaita literally means a fool. But a Shaita is some sort of, halachically speaking, a Shaita, a fool, not just someone who's, low IQ. But it seems like it's a kind of mental illness. It's a sort of cognitive what's the word? Person who's cognitively impaired, to the point, if I remember correctly, the definition of a shaita is someone who you give them a few dollars to buy something in the market and don't know how much change to bring back to you. So you're talking about someone who's really like a clinical imbecile. Yeah? Somebody who's it's clinical. It's not like the guy's a fool. A clinical fool, is it?
Cognitive lack.
Cognitively impaired.
Right.
Something like that.
It's not, well.
It's not the insulting fool, is what I mean to say. It's the clinical fool. A fool is a bad translation. It's just in common parlance, we use the word shaita.
But acts like a fool.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Someone who has a medically
the word shaita,
cognition.
that's right. In common parlance, the word shaita is used to describe someone who's acting silly. Yeah. But it's not the halachic definition. Exactly. The halachic definition is someone who's cognitively impaired. So a woman who's married to a deaf mute, or a woman who's married to someone who's cognitively impaired, a shaita, the Aish says, the Aishes she'imum, and the wife of one who is a she'imum. She'imum Rashi translates as lokoi betimoin levov. He is stricken, he is afflicted, he's got another clinical issue, but this clinical issue is timoin levov. Timoin levov is the expression we use actually in our confession on Yom Kippur. For sins that we've done in like, Timoin levov means like a shocked or anxious heart. Like we couldn't control ourselves, we just did something wrong, right? So this is a kind of another mental illness. Maybe some sort of extreme anxiety of some sort. Timoin levov is like someone who's like
clinical depression.
Perhaps something like that. Yeah. But the point is maybe it's some sort of mental illness, clearly.
Right.
Sorry?
But not necessarily.
Luckily means like not like he's acting foolishly. Luckily, Hashem inflicted him with this illness. So that's right. Technically speaking, he can still, which is why he married. He gave a woman a ring and he married her. But he can't be held responsible for a lot of his actions, which is a very, very interesting thing. I just when preparing this Gemara, it really struck me how the halacha takes into consideration mental illness in the shaita and the shimum, 2 different types of mental illness. Perhaps the difference being one is a question of like mental capacity, one is a question of emotional capacity.
How did he do the marriage? How would he do was he like it was always like that, or he became like how would he do the?
He become a shaita later. It's possible he became a shaita later, but to the best of my knowledge, if a shaita marries and she accepts, the marriage is, even though they're not encouraged, but it's still. Let's say he had a nervous breakdown later in life, maybe, I don't know.
So these are all the husband attributes.
That's right. So now, the verse is talking about husband. The verse says each and every man.
Right.
So says Rabbi Yonasan, or says the Gemara, what Rabbi Yonasan would need that verse to do is to teach us that when a husband is cognitively impaired and doesn't have the capacity to issue a warning, either because he's a deaf mute or because he's a shaita, he's a cognitively impaired, or he's suffering from some sort of other mental illness, so he's incapable of warning his wife, either because he literally can't speak, he's a deaf mute, or because he doesn't have the cognition to be able to be aware of what's going on to warn his wife. And maybe she's even taking advantage of his situation. So says Rabbi Yonasan, this verse which says each and every man is there to tell you that the Beth Din can step in and issue the warning on his behalf. We discussed this in the Mishnah, that the Beis Din can issue a warning. Right? Then we had the discussion in the Mishnah whether that warning is just for the sake of her losing the ketubah if she misbehaves, or does the warning go as far as taking her to the temple? But either way, we have the verse which says each and every man, to expand the definition of who can issue the warning, to include the Beth Din stepping in on behalf of a man who is impaired and incapable of issuing the warning to his wife for whatever reason. Okay, so now we've settled.
So he would be able to, since it's Rabbi Yochanan, he would be able to opinion that these three type of husbands are allowed to. She forfeits her ketubah,
But the Beis Din,
right? Because
the Beis Din doesn't want it.
Opinion, right? That these people don't go to
would they go to the court? Would they go to the temple?
because-
I don't know. We have a view on that. The Mishnah gives two views, right?
right.
The Mishnah gives two views whether we would go to the.
Just
Either way,
to forfeit her ketubah.
Yeah, well, yes. So we'll discuss the Gemara's going to discuss it later. But either way, the husband has to take her to the temple. The question is, if the husband taking her to the temple, does he have to issue his own warning, or can he rely on Beis Din's warning? That was the discussion in the Gemara,
Right.
right? But the Gemara discussed someone who's in jail amongst these cases as well. So maybe we'll put that aside for now because it's not really relevant to the discussion at the moment. And the Gemara is going to revisit the discussion about a warning that Beis Din issues and how far it goes. The Gemara is going to revisit that. Okay, but for now we're just substantiating the verse, that the verse which states each and every man, Rabbi Yonasan can use that as an inclusive description to include someone who's incapable of issuing a warning. The Beis Din will do it on his behalf.
Right.
So we have an inclusive verse. How far it goes, we'll see already later.
No, I just want to understand it. But
Yeah.
he's doing this all to support his original statement, right? That he needs to substantiate Yoshia's
Verse, yeah.
verse in order to go back to his original argument is that
That the
everyone is
engaged woman and the one waiting is excluded.
I'm sorry?
In order to substantiate his original opinion, which
Yeah.
was that the engaged woman and the woman waiting for her deceased husband's brother is not included.
Not included.
They're not included in Sotah law. As for the expansive verse, that's coming to include someone who's incapable of warning his wife, that Beis Din may step in.
Okay.
That's all. Yeah.
Okay.
So now the question comes the other way around. Rabbi Yoshia, which was of the view that the one waiting for the deceased husband, we're clear, Robert?
Got it now. Okay, so we don't know what they're going to do with these.
That's right.
Yeah.
How far the
It
Beis
just
Din
says that he's just supporting that those other two
are not
are
included.
not
That's
included.
correct. So exactly.
I went
So
a
how?
bit too far.
That's right. So how far the Beis Din's warning goes is the question we had in the Mishnah, which we'll revisit in the Gemara later.
Later.
Right? Does it go just for the sake that she loses the ketubah, or does it go so far that the husband can later take her to the temple? We'll discuss that later. But for now, have a good day.
Have a good day.
For now, what we're substantiating is that Rabbi Yonasan can maintain his view that engaged women,
Two categories.
those two categories are excluded because we have two verses that say his wife or her husband. One verse that says his wife and one that says her husband. So because we have two verses that say they have to be married, we can exclude two different types of non-marriage relationships, namely the engaged woman and the woman who's waiting for the deceased husband's brother. As for the verse, which expands the definition of husband by saying each and every man, that's coming to include Beis Din stepping in when the husband cannot issue the warning. How far the Beis Din's warning goes, we'll deal with that later.
Just want to step back a second.
Yeah.
So those two that are excluded under Rabbi Yochanan's opinion,
Yeah,
the husband still, or the soon-to-be husbands, the wife forfeits her ketubah in that?
certainly forfeits the ketubah.
We learned that already.
Yeah, yes, certainly.
But they don't go to drink.
They don't go to drink. That's right. They don't go to drink. That's right. They don't go to drink. Right?
I believe that's what we learned.
Yep. You're right. They don't go to drink.
This doesn't say you're allowed to
That's right. They don't go to drink.
drink.
They don't go to drink, but they forfeit the ketubah. That's right.
We learned that because that was a lesson we were learning that perhaps protect
Protect both. That's correct. That's right. Okay. So now comes the question the other way around. Top of Chav Daled with Beis, top of 24b, second word. Rabbi Yoshia, who is of the view that the verse which reads his wife, that comes to exclude an engaged woman, a betrothed woman. But Rabbi Yoshia said, the fact that the Torah says each and every man comes to include the woman waiting for a deceased husband's brother. So in Rabbi Yoshia's view, we only exclude one of the two from the Sotah law. We exclude the engaged woman, but we don't exclude the one waiting for a deceased husband's brother, the Shemeres Yavam, and she does qualify the Sotah, at least as far as the warning goes, right? So the question becomes, Hai tachas isha, my avidle. Later in the verse says, right, there was twice the verse said married. Once it said,
he has to substantiate Rabbi Yonatan.
Exactly. He has to substantiate, that's right. He has to substantiate your innocence verse. One verse which says his wife. Okay, that comes to exclude the engaged woman. But the other verse says that she, in the warning, right? When he that's right. I'm sorry, not in the warning. At the end, after the warning, the Torah says, this is the law of the
double expression.
One second. This is the law of the warnings for a woman who shall stray to a man other than her husband.
That says it twice?
Again, saying her husband.
Right, that was what he.
That's right.
That's what he was relying on. The double.
He was relying on the double expression of ish, each and every man, to include the Shemeres Yavan. But we have now another verse which says her husband. She betrayed him instead of her husband, which comes again to exclude. Following? Now, yes, Bays, on the base, top of the page. Right, following? Rabbi Yonasan had two verses.
We have two verses, Rabbi Yonatan says we have two verses that exclude the non-wife.
That's right. One which says, okay, so let's
both cases.
That's right. So one verse which said his wife. Okay, so Rabbi Yoshia is okay with that because that excludes engaged woman. But another verse says she strayed from her husband. Again, implying that the relationship must be husband and wife. So what does that come to teach us? Rabbi Yonasan used that verse to exclude the woman waiting for her deceased husband's brother. But Rabbi Yoshia says that the woman waiting for her deceased brother, husband's brother, is included in the Sotah law, considering the verse each and every man. So what does he do with this last verse, which says she betrayed her husband, implying that they have to be husband and wife? Clear? Mm-hmm. So Rabbi Yeshua, Hai tachas isha, this verse which says that she would stray from her husband. My avidle, what does he do with that verse? This is the verse that Rabbi Yonasan used to support his view that we have to exclude two kinds of relationships, whereas Rabbi Yeshua only excluded one relationship. So says the Gemara like this: Rabbi Yeshua needs it lahakish to compare ish leisha, a man to a woman, the isha leish, and a woman to a man. Okay, so the Gemara does not explain what this is, but the Gemara will explain it in about 3 pages from now. And essentially like this: there are other types of people that are excluded from the Sotah law. How is that? For example, Torah says that the woman shall stand, the woman shall stand in the temple. What if she's lame? Her legs don't work, or she doesn't have legs. So she's excluded from the Sotah law. Because the Torah says she has to be standing in the temple, and she can't stand. So you
can stand on her thighs or whatever she has remaining. Whatever.
That's your opinion, not the opinion of the verses. Right? The verse says she stands. This doesn't constitute a standing halachically. Fine. In other words, it's not metaphorical, she shall stand as in she will place. But stand means literally she's standing on her 2 feet.
And if before the temple, was it?
Yeah, she has to be standing in the temple. So if she's lame, she's excluded. She's excluded, right? But the verse which says standing, or the verse that requires standing, is only said of the woman. But because the verse compares man to woman and woman to man, therefore we derive that if the man is lame, let's say she can stand, but he can't. she still won't qualify as a Sotah. Because whatever disqualifies her, disqualifies him. So if the verse told us that she's disqualified because she can't stand, then if he can't stand, he's also disqualified, even if she could. Likewise, the verse says, for example, I'm going to go the other way now. The verse says that she concealed herself from the eyes of her husband by going behind closed doors. From the eyes of the husband, implying that he has eyes that work. What if he's blind? If he's blind, Sotah law is called off. So because now we're comparing man to woman and woman to man, if he can see but she is blind, also Sotah called off. Because again, we compare husband to wife and wife to husband. So whatever qualifying features the Torah says about her, apply to him. And whatever qualifying features the Torah says about him, apply to her. And that law, says Rabbi Yeshua, is derived from the fact that the verse says she strayed instead of her husband. By saying instead of her husband, the Torah is telling us, look at the husband's features, look at the wife's features, and they must be the same. Whatever disqualifying features apply to her, apply to him. And whatever disqualifying features apply to him, apply to her. So whereas Rabbi Yonasan used this verse, which says she strayed from her husband to tell us that they have to be actual husband and wife, and therefore the woman waiting for her deceased husband to consummate the marriage is excluded. Rabbi Yeshua says this verse has nothing to do with excluding anybody or excluding any relationships, because a woman waiting for a deceased husband's brother may qualify as a Sotah, because the verse said each and every man to include. What does this verse do? That verse is there to compare husband to wife and wife to husband, to teach us that whatever disqualifies her, disqualifies him, whatever disqualifies him, disqualifies her. The details of this disqualification we discussed in 3 pages from now. I just gave you 2 examples. One example going from husband to wife, vision, and one example, wife to husband, she got to stand. All right, is that clear?
It says,
A little more of a pilpul, but we got it. Sorry?
I thought it said husband to husband, and then, or no, husband to wife, and then ish to ish, husband.
So the verse of, one is husband to wife, that he takes his wife to the temple, right, his wife.
Yeah.
And the other verse is she strayed from her husband.
Oh, okay.
Right? So that verse from her husband, in Rabbi Yeshua's view, is just to tell you that husband and wife share the same qualifications, or must share the same qualifications and the same disqualifications. Whereas Rabbi Yonasan says that those words, she strayed from his wife, comes to exclude another relationship where they're not actually married.
Okay, so they have different opinions of what the verse.
That's right. Same thing with ish. When the verse says each and every man, which is an inclusive term, right? In Rabbi Yeshua's view, each and every man comes to include someone who's not exactly married,
Yeah, those 3 cases.
but almost married. In Rabbi Yeshua's view, comes to include someone who's not actually married, the woman waiting for the husband, deceased husband's brother. But in Rabbi Yonasan's view, it comes to include the imbecile, the mental illness, and the one who can't, the deaf mute. So again, 2 different ways of breaking down the various verses. Okay, so this is the next stage in our pilpul. So see if you can put a pin in this and remember it till Monday, because in Monday, God willing, the pilpul continues. The Gemara is going to throw in another wrench, just in case our minds are not fully ingrained with God's way of thinking. The Gemara is going to give us another twist so we can really be thinking the way Hashem thinks.
It's like a boxing match, both stages are now sort of.
That's right. I've said this before and I say it all the time, and because it's important to remember this. And the Tanya reminds us that every time you're learning, you have to remind yourself of this, especially when you're learning laws that don't have any practical ramification. Remember, this is in God's Torah, and the very exercise of using our mental capacity and mental bandwidth to try to understand as best as we can God's logic, that in and of itself is a very, actually Tanya writes, the deepest unification and oneness union that we can achieve with Hashem. That our mind is suffused, surrounded, and embedded within the divine knowledge and wisdom. So even if there's no practical ramifications to this Gemara, we spent a half an hour breaking our heads to try to understand God's logic. That itself is the value to keep us.
Rabbi, it's absolutely wonderful. Rabbi, it's absolutely wonderful to recognize the tremendous compassion that is there in the law on a constant basis when we're speaking about those who are mentally ill, when we're speaking about those who might have strayed in a certain way. Anything that can allow for a leniency is just absolutely so remarkable how it's ingrained. sort of, I'm going to try to make it less. I'm going to try to make it just to realize. So what a lesson that is for us in life, in the judgments with regard to people. And each one of us is a judge really in life.
Yep.
How would we judge others to be able to, in some way, be sensitive to whatever we can do for leniency that could be applied.
That's right.
It's absolutely wonderful. You know, it reminds me, there's a beautiful story that even can be told to children in a beautiful way, of this child who brought an egg from several blocks that your father once spoke about. I think it was your father who mentioned it, from several blocks. And he comes to this rabbi who was a real great paskin in Jerusalem. And the child presents the egg in a bowl and says to the rabbi, "Is this egg kosher?" And you're aware of the story. No. So immediately the teacher says, the paskin says immediately, "Of course, yes, of course it's kosher." The child goes off very happy, and the students of the rabbi who were with him says, "How could you say that? You didn't even look at the egg." If a child comes to me from several blocks away with one egg in her bowl, it means her mother really needs it so badly.
Yeah, like
it's just amazing. So the sensitivity with regard to every element, to recognize in everything that we do, how we can, it's like a 1/60th with regard to the kosher or not kosher, with regard to something that's in a chicken soup or something, how we should be so lenient. What a lesson. Each one of these is a moral lesson for life in everything that we do, and how we judge others, even from the perspective of, from the slightest thing in life to everything else.
Yeah.
Have I given every possibility of understanding and recognition to that person, rather than to look at it from the point of view that I would want to condemn the person?
Yeah, there's the law, and then there's the dignity of the law.
Exactly.
Have to be maintained.
And yet the law has to be maintained, but at the same time recognizing whatever can be found halachically to be able to exonerate the person, that I can find, I should be able to do that, because the law is right there in that way, building in compassion within the law. I thank you, Rabbi. Yeshikoach. Good job, you should go from strength to strength. All the very best, Yehoshua, and to all of you. I thank you so much for the beautiful week, Rabbi. God bless you.
Wonderful day. Good Shabbos.